The ground shook that morning, not with an earthquake, not with thunder, but with the metallic groan of the backhoe outside my house. I stood on the porch, clutching my robe tighter, watching the machine dig into the earth I had walked across for 40 years. Suddenly, the operator pulled the lever back, the bucket clanging to a halt. Dust rose, sunlight caught on glass, and one of the masons bent down slowly, carefully, as if he'd just found a relic. He held something up to the light, a blue mason jar streaked with mud, sealed with wax that time had cracked but not broken. Around its neck hung a ribbon I knew instantly. My breath caught. That was Ben's ribbon. He'd used it to tie gifts, mark fishing poles, even once to hold together the Christmas tree when the stand broke. 100 memories flickered in that fraying strip of cloth. The mason brushed off the mud and called up to me, "Mom, looks like this belongs to you." My knees wobbled as he placed it in my hands. Heavy, cold, and when I turned it, I saw a tag, faded but legible. My husband's handwriting. Open when we're brave enough. I pressed the jar against my chest, my heart pounding so hard I thought the workers might hear it over their machines. Brave enough. Brave for what? I carried it into the kitchen, placed it on the table as carefully as if it were glass holding lightning. My fingers trembled as I dug through the junk drawer until I found the old letter opener. The wax cracked with a sound like brittle bones. I peeled it away slowly, almost reverently, until the lid turned loose. Inside, folded slips of paper, 20 of them, each crease yellowed, each edge fragile. I could see Ben's broad script on the top one. I pulled it out with shaking hands. The ink was still dark, as if waiting all these years for me to read it. "Dance in the rain," it said. No umbrella, no apology. I pressed the slip to my lips, eyes burning. I remembered the night we wrote these, our first year of marriage, sprawled on the floor of our tiny apartment with cheap wine and endless laughter. We promised each other a life filled with daring and foolish, beautiful acts. But the jar had been tucked away, buried, forgotten. And now, nearly 20 years after his passing, it had risen out of the ground like a voice. I sat there at the kitchen table staring at the slip until the letters blurred. My whole body shook with something between grief and awakening. The world had changed. I had grown older, lonelier, quieter. But this jar was telling me, not finished yet. Not nearly finished. I picked up Ben's old tape recorder from the shelf, the one I hadn't touched in years, pressed the red button and whispered, "Ben, I found our jar, and I'm going to finish every single wish." The jar sat on the counter all morning like a guest waiting for me to explain myself. I couldn't keep it secret for long. I had to tell someone. So I called my daughter Lena first. Lena, with her careful voice and her planner always open on the table, she listened quietly as I told her about the jar, about the wishes Ben and I wrote so many years ago. And when I paused, expecting her to laugh or maybe even cry with me, she sighed instead. "Mom," she said, "you can't just go running around chasing old scraps of paper. You're 62. You need stability. Why not think seriously about that condo we looked at last spring? Safe building, no stairs, no surprises." Her tone softened, but it was the kind of softness you use when telling a child they've had enough candy. I heard the subtext loud and clear. Be smaller, be safer, stop dreaming. After we hung up, I sat staring at the kitchen wall until the silence felt too heavy. I dialed my son, Evan. He always tried to be gentler, less direct than his sister. He listened longer, asked questions about the jar, and then gave a little laugh. "Sounds like something Dad would have dreamed up. But maybe you should, I don't know, take it slow. Maybe later, when things settle down." Things. As if life ever really settled. His voice was warm, but behind it I still heard the same message. "Don't stir the waters, Mom. Don't risk too much." When I hung up, the phone felt heavier than the jar. I set it down on the counter and walked to the shelf where Ben's old tape recorder sat, covered in dust. I pressed the button and the wheels began to turn with that low hum. My throat tightened. "I'm still here, love," I whispered. "They think I should shrink, but I think you left me this jar to grow." I picked up the next slip, and on the back, in Ben's slanted script, was another line: "Return something borrowed long ago." At first I smiled, a simple task compared to dancing in the rain. But then, a pang hit, sharp as a pin. I knew exactly what it meant. In my sewing basket, tucked under spools of thread and tangled ribbon, was a silver thimble. Mrs. Patel's silver thimble. I had borrowed it during the church quiltathon more than 30 years ago. She had asked for it once, gently, and I'd promised to bring it back. But somehow it had stayed, a small piece of someone else's life hidden in mine. I held it in my palm, the metal cool against my skin, and chuckled softly, half guilty, half amazed. Of all the wishes Ben and I could have written, of course he would remember the thimble. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the colour of pewter. The air felt restless, pressing against the windows, carrying the smell of rain before the first drop even fell. I stood at the back door barefoot, the slip of paper still on the table behind me. Dance in the rain, no umbrella, no apology. My chest thudded like a drum. It had been decades since I'd done anything so foolish on purpose. The first crack of thunder rolled across the neighbourhood. A curtain of rain swept the yard, heavy and sudden, bouncing against the porch rail. For a moment I only watched, my breath caught, the sensible part of me whispering, "Stay dry, stay inside, be sensible." But I reached for the screen door handle anyway. My bare feet met the wet boards with a shock of cold. I stepped out into it, the sky spilling itself over me, my hair plastered to my forehead in seconds. I tried to sway, awkwardly at first, my arms stiff like a scarecrow's. My knees creaked, my shoulders protested. I almost turned back. And then another thunderclap echoed and something in me loosened. I lifted my arms and spun clumsily, my nightgown clinging to me, my toes splashing in puddles that grew faster than I could count. From across the street, Mrs. Alvarez waved from her porch, shaking her head and laughing. I laughed back, louder than I meant to. That laugh cracked me open further. I twirled again, slipped a little, nearly fell, then steadied myself with a squeal. And I felt it. That ridiculous, impossible feeling. Alive. A voice called out, "You're amazing." I turned and saw Jax, the lanky teenager who lived down the block, holding up his phone. For once, it didn't feel like mockery. He grinned wide, shaking his head, rain dripping off his baseball cap. He jogged closer, phone forgotten. "My grandma used to dance in storms, every summer. She passed this spring, and you looked just like her out there." His voice cracked in a way that made me stop spinning. I placed a wet hand on his shoulder, both of us dripping, both of us smiling in a sad, strange way. "Then maybe she's here with us," I said. He nodded, blinking rain from his eyes. By the time I stepped back inside, leaving wet footprints across the kitchen floor, my phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Lena. A link. Effects of isolation on seniors. As if loneliness was something you could diagnose with an article. My thumbs shook from the cold as I typed back, "I'm not isolated, I'm dancing." The silver thimble sat in my coat pocket like a stone as I walked down the block to Patel's corner shop. The little bell above the door gave its familiar tinny chime when I pushed it open, and the smell of cardamom and floor polish wrapped around me like memory itself. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Patel, her hair now more silver than black, her glasses sliding down her nose. She squinted at me for a moment, then her face changed. Recognition, surprise, and something softer. "Mae Whitaker," she whispered. Before I could answer, she came around the counter and pulled me into a hug that lasted long enough to say all the words we didn't. When she finally leaned back, her eyes were wet. I pulled the thimble from my pocket and placed it in her palm. "I think this belongs to you," I said. Her hand trembled as she held it. "I thought this was gone forever," she murmured. "I stopped sewing after my husband passed. Couldn't bear the quiet of it." She closed her fingers around the thimble, then looked at me with a small, brave smile. "But maybe it's time I begin again." We sat together at the counter for nearly an hour, trading fragments of stories stitched with silence. At one point she reached across, patting my hand. "Come on Thursdays," she said. "We will sew together. Even if we don't finish anything, we will keep each other company." The idea of it filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years, the promise of new companionship made from something borrowed long ago. When I left the shop, the sun had slipped lower, turning the windows into molten gold. I walked home slowly, the sound of the bell still ringing in my chest. On my kitchen table, the jar waited patiently, as if it knew I had passed the second test. I reached inside and pulled out the next slip. "Ride a train without a plan." I laughed out loud, alone in the kitchen. Ben had loved trains, the clatter and rhythm, the way the world blurred by like a film reel. My chest ached as I remembered the one time we'd gotten off at the wrong stop, Riverton, a sleepy little town, and found ourselves eating the best lemon pie I had ever tasted in a diner that no longer exists in the guidebooks. I opened my laptop and searched. There it was, a cheap regional route running through Riverton. My heart thumped in time with the remembered beat of rails. I whispered to the empty room, "Ben, I think we're going back." The platform smelled of diesel and coffee, the sort of scent that clings to travel itself. I found my seat by the window, track 7, car 3, seat 12, and settled in with the jar's folded slips, tucked safely in my bag. As the train lurched forward, the rhythm began. Metal wheels striking notes only trains know, steady and hypnotic. Across the aisle, a man about my age folded his newspaper with care, then caught my eye with a smile. He wore a corduroy jacket that had seen better days and held a creased map, edges soft from use. "Arthur Delgado," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm but gentle, a lineman's strength softened by retirement. We slipped easily into conversation the way travellers sometimes do, about broken toasters, the sweetness of summer peaches, and the way time steals and gifts at once. He spoke of his late wife without flinching, and I spoke of Ben in a voice that trembled but did not break. The train swayed, and with it came a feeling I hadn't expected. Companionship in motion. Arthur noticed the photo on my phone when I scrolled absent-mindedly, the jar, still streaked with mud, sitting on my kitchen counter. He tilted his head. "What's the bravest wish in there?" he asked. His eyes were kind but searching, the kind of eyes that knew what it meant to wait for an honest answer. I laughed softly, deflecting. "I haven't decided yet." The train slowed as Riverton came into view, its small station crouched like a memory waiting to be remembered. I stepped onto the platform, my heart thudding, breath sharp with hope. The streets looked older, narrower, as though they'd folded in on themselves since Ben and I had wandered them. I found the corner where the pie shop once stood. My steps quickened, but then I stopped cold. The windows were dusty, the door chained shut. A faded sign in the glass read, "Thank you for every Sunday." My chest hollowed. The shop was gone. Not closed for the day, but gone forever. I pressed a palm to the glass, remembering the tang of lemon on my tongue, Ben's grin as he stole the last bite from my plate. The silence behind the glass felt like a tomb. My throat tightened, and for a moment I nearly turned away. But then I saw it. A scrap of lace caught in the frame of the door, yellowed with time, trembling in the wind. I reached down, freed it gently, and slipped it into my pocket. A keepsake no one would miss, a thread of memory to carry home. As the train whistle called us back, I whispered, "Thank you for every Sunday," and turned away. The thrift store smelled of old books and lavender sachets, the kind of scent that carries both dust and comfort. I wandered past stacks of china plates, chipped teacups, lamps with crooked shades, until the clerk at the counter noticed the lace scrap I had tucked in my hand. She leaned forward, squinting. That piece? Where did you find it? I told her about Riverton, the closed pie shop, the fallen thread from the doorway. Her eyes widened. That belonged to Mara. She was the baker. Every Sunday after church, she set up a little corner table. We all called it the wish table. Folks would write down what they were hoping for. A new job, a second chance, a recipe they'd lost. Sometimes people answered wishes right there. Sometimes it just helped to pin the words up where someone else could see. I turned the lace over in my palm, feeling the delicate fray against my skin. A wish table. My heart fluttered with the idea, like a bird trying out its wings. Could I do that at home? Could my dining room, so long silent, become a place for other people's longings? The clerk disappeared into the back and returned with a corkboard, old and scarred, with a few rusty pushpins still clinging to its surface. Take this, she said. It belonged to Mara too. She would have wanted it used. I accepted it as if she'd handed me a treasure chest. On the train ride back, I set the corkboard on the empty seat beside me, running my fingers over the holes where other people's hopes had once been fastened. I pulled out Ben's recorder and pressed the button. The wheels hummed beneath us, steady and sure. Ben, I whispered. Maybe wishes need a table. Maybe they need a wall and a place to land. Maybe all people really need is someone to listen. The recorder clicked as I stopped it, and I leaned back into the seat, watching the fields roll by. Back home, I would clear the dining room table, dust off the chairs, and set a pot of soup to simmer. The vision was both terrifying and exhilarating. When I unpacked later that night, I returned to the jar, my hands still trembling. The next slip unfolded with a faint crackle. Host strangers for supper. My stomach flipped, fear fluttering like moth wings inside me. Strangers in my house. What if no one came? What if they did? But then my heartbeat steadied, just as the wheels of the train had steadied me. I looked up at the corkboard leaning against the wall and whispered, I will. I hadn't hosted anyone in my house for years. My hands shook as I chopped onions, the scent of them burning my eyes as much as the fear in my chest. I made chicken soup the way my mother had taught me, slow, with bones simmering until the broth turned golden and fragrant. While it cooked, I taped a sign to the lamppost outside. Supper at Mae Whitaker's. All welcome. Bring your hunger. The letters looked shaky, my handwriting rusty, but once the paper fluttered in the wind, it was too late to take it back. When 6 o'clock came, I sat at the table staring at the 3 bowls I'd set, half convinced no one would arrive. Then, the doorbell rang. First was Jax, the lanky boy from down the street, rain dance witness, and secret ally. He carried nothing but a grin and an awkward shrug. I wasn't sure if you meant it, he said, but I'm starving. I waved him in, heart lifting. Next came a woman I didn't know, tall in blue scrubs, her hair pulled back with tired precision. Eleanor, she introduced herself, voice soft but frayed at the edges. I just moved here last month. The sign, it sounded nice. Her eyes darted around like she wasn't used to being invited. I welcomed her in, pressing a warm bowl into her hands. Finally, as if fate had been listening, there stood Arthur Delgado from the train. He held a bag of rolls fresh from the bakery and smiled sheepishly. Didn't want to come empty-handed. My throat tightened. Of all people, here he was. I ushered him in, and suddenly the silence of my dining room was replaced with the sound of clinking silverware and hesitant laughter. After we ate, I pulled out the corkboard, the wish table, setting it in the centre of the room with scraps of paper and pins. If you'd like, I said, my voice wobbling, write something you hope for. Anything at all. Jax wrote first, pinning his note with a careless jab. A summer job that isn't frying oil. Eleanor hesitated, then wrote in careful script, one good night's sleep. She pinned it with a sigh that spoke louder than her words. Arthur stood last, smoothing his paper before fastening it. Fix the Riverwalk lights. The path is too dark. People avoid it now. I can do the work. I just can't do it alone. The room was quiet as his words hung in the air. I felt the weight of them, heavier than soup bowls or empty chairs. And before I knew it, before reason or caution could catch me, my heart spoke through my mouth. Then we'll help you. The jar offered up its next command with a papery sigh. Write the words I swallowed. I carried the slip to my desk and sat there a long time, the lamp glow soft against the wall, a teacup cooling by my hand. My chest felt tight because I knew exactly which words it meant. The first letter was to my sister, Ruth. We hadn't spoken for 10 years before she died. 10 years of stubborn silence, 10 years of swallowed apologies and sharp words that should have softened with time, but instead grew teeth. I picked up my pen, and the ink bled across the page faster than I could think. Dear Ruth, I'm sorry for the last day we saw each other. I'm sorry I chose pride instead of you. I should have knocked on your door, should have called, should have let you be angry until you weren't. I wish I'd told you you were my best friend long before you were my sister. I wish I'd said I missed you. I wish I'd told you I loved you every single day. The words poured out, and when I finished, I folded the paper carefully, as if it were her hand. I knew it would never reach her, but somehow writing it steadied me, like laying down a burden I had carried too long. The second letter was to someone else, myself, a younger me who stood at 35, exhausted and afraid, juggling bills and children and a husband slipping away from health. Dear Mae Whitaker, I wrote, you did enough. You were enough. You survived what tried to break you. Don't be so hard on the woman you became, because she kept the roof over your head, she raised kind children, and she never stopped showing up, even when she was invisible to herself. When both letters were folded, I slipped a copy of Ruth's into an envelope and pinned it to the wish table. For anyone who needs it, I wrote across the top. Maybe someone else was swallowing the same words, and maybe they didn't have to. That night the phone rang. Lena's voice was tight, sharp, like a string pulled too hard. Mom, boundaries. You can't just invite strangers into your house. It isn't safe. I closed my eyes, listening to her fear, and then I spoke quietly. 3 people walked out lighter than when they came in, Lena, and so did I. If that's unsafe, then maybe it's a risk worth taking. The silence that followed was long. I heard her sigh, the sound of love tangled with worry. And then, the line went still. The petition Arthur and I carried into the town office felt flimsy in our hands, though it bore more than 100 signatures. We laid it on the clerk's desk, asking for the Riverwalk to be relit, for safety, for dignity, for memory. She skimmed the pages with bored eyes and said, "The council will review." Review? A word that might as well have been a yawn. Arthur clenched his jaw and I felt the heat of disappointment rise in my cheeks. Bureaucracy moved slower than grief, and grief was already heavy enough. That night at my dining room table, we gathered with Jax and Eleanor. We decided we wouldn't wait for permission. On Saturday we carried jars with tea lights tucked inside, dozens of them glowing like little beating hearts. We handed them out, neighbour to neighbour, until more than 50 people stood with us at the river's edge. The water was dark, the path darker, but our jars shimmered against the current. We began to walk. Slowly, carefully, children holding jars as if they carried entire galaxies in their palms. At every third lamppost we paused, and someone spoke a name into the night, a name of someone they had lost. Marjorie, Tom, Grandma June. Each name rose, hung in the air, and settled into the water. A hush moved through the crowd after everyone, the kind of silence that honours without asking for applause. Eleanor whispered, "Daniel," her voice breaking, and I touched her shoulder. Jax's voice cracked as he said, "Grandma Alma." And when it was my turn, I whispered, Ben. The river seemed to carry his name further than the rest. Cameras clicked. The local paper had shown up, surprised at the sight of us. The flash against the water made the jars glitter like constellations. Arthur lifted his chin, proud, the lines of his face softened by light. The next week, the council didn't yawn. They promised action, promised the lights would shine again before winter. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was enough. Proof that doing, not discussing, was what moved the world forward. Later back home, I pressed the recorder's red button. The tape spun with its low hum, the sound that had become my second heartbeat. Ben, I said softly. I thought I wanted permission. Turns out I wanted company. Turns out what I needed was a crowd of glowing jars, voices in the dark, people brave enough to say the names they still carry. I stopped the tape and sat in the quiet, the glow of the memory warming me more than any lamp could. The slip from the jar unfolded with a kind of mischief in its creases. Bake Mara's lemon pie. I could almost hear Ben laughing at the thought of it. Lemon pie had always been my nemesis. The crust too tough, the filling too runny, the meringue either collapsing or turning rubbery. Still, a wish was a wish. I dug through cookbooks, flour already dusting my sweater, until I found one that resembled what Mara's niece had once described in an article. I zested lemons, measured sugar, whisked eggs until my arm ached. The kitchen filled with a scent both sharp and sweet. For a moment I believed I had it. But when I pulled the pie from the oven, the filling sloshed like soup, the crust had burned at the edges, and the meringue sagged into a sticky swamp. I stared at it, then burst into laughter so sudden it startled me. Lemon almost, I declared to the empty room. That evening I carried the disaster into the wish supper, announcing it proudly. Not quite lemon pie, but lemon almost. The room erupted with applause as though I'd unveiled a masterpiece. Jax took a bite, made a face, and still raised his fork in salute. Eleanor laughed harder than I'd ever heard her, the sound shaking something loose in all of us. Arthur chewed thoughtfully, then said, "Could use a little practice," with a wink that made me laugh again. Between spoonfuls of soup and bites of rolls, wishes began to unfold themselves. Eleanor confessed, cheeks pink, that since the lantern walk she'd finally slept through an entire night without waking. Jax reported that he had an interview at the bike shop downtown, his eyes bright with hope that didn't look fragile anymore. Arthur leaned back, folding his map with care, and said he would teach me the proper way to bake Mara's pie. But only if you teach me how to sew this jacket before it falls apart. He tugged at the sleeve of his corduroy coat, seams fraying like a life too well lived. I agreed, and in that small exchange, pie for stitches, sweetness for thread, something intimate passed between us. Not romance, not yet, but the kind of trust that grows in kitchens where laughter fills the cracks left by failure. When everyone had gone, I stood at the counter brushing flour off the edge with my palm. The ruined pie sat half-eaten, its filling still sliding, but somehow it felt like triumph. Wishes didn't demand perfection, only the courage to try, and the grace to share the mess with others. The phone rang at 2 a.m, its shrill tone slicing through the quiet house. For a moment I thought it was a wrong number, but then I saw Evan's name glowing on the screen. My heart lurched. I answered quickly, whispering, "Evan." His voice was low, frayed. "Mom, can I come over? Just for a night?" An hour later, headlights swept across the driveway, and there he was on my porch holding a duffel bag like it was packed with stones. His face looked hollow, drawn tight by something heavier than exhaustion. I opened the door without a word, pulled him into my arms and felt his shoulders tremble once before he pulled back. We didn't go to the guest room right away. Instead, we wrapped ourselves in blankets and sat on the porch swing, steam curling from 2 mugs of tea between us. The night was quiet except for the soft patter of leaves stirring in the dark. Finally he spoke. "It's Sarah," he said, staring into his cup. I don't know if we're going to make it. She says I'm never home, that I care more about work than us. She's not wrong. I just, I don't know how to fix it. My first instinct was to leap in with advice, to build a scaffold of solutions around him the way I used to patch scraped knees with band-aids. But I stopped myself. I remembered the slip I had pulled earlier that day. Be the person I needed once. And what I had needed once was someone who wouldn't try to fix me but would just listen. So I kept my voice soft, steady. Tell me. He talked about missed dinners, unspoken resentments, nights spent on the couch, words that landed like stones. His voice cracked once, then steadied, then cracked again. I reached for the recorder, the one that had been sitting on the porch rail, and without explaining slid it toward him. Talk to your future self, I whispered. He looked at me, confused at first, then pressed the button. His words spilled out in a halting rhythm. Promises to be more present, confessions of fear, quiet I love yous. He hadn't said enough. I turned my face away to give him privacy, staring out into the night as tears rolled silently down his cheeks, hidden by the dark. When he finished, he set the recorder down, and we both exhaled at the same moment, the sound soft and shaky. The night smelled of rain and jasmine, and in that quiet I felt it, the faint fragile weight of second chances. The next slip from the jar felt heavier than the others, as if the ink itself carried weight. Let go of a guilt that has teeth. I knew at once what it meant. Some guilts nibble at you and fade with time. Others sink their jaws in and never loosen. Mine was Ruth, my sister, gone now a decade, and the day she asked me for help. I'd been tired, stretched thin, and instead of compassion I gave her sharp words that pushed her further away. That moment had gnawed at me ever since, so I took a plain sheet of paper and wrote it down in careful lines. I'm sorry for snapping when you reached out. I'm sorry I made you feel like a burden when you were asking for love. I folded the paper slowly, crease by crease, until it became a small boat. My fingers trembled as if folding it made the memory real again. At dusk I carried it to the river. The air was cool, the water moving slow and steady, the surface catching light like a mirror that couldn't quite hold still. I crouched at the edge and set the little boat on the water. For a moment it spun in circles caught by an eddy, as if it didn't want to leave me either. Then the current took it, carrying it away from my reach. I whispered, I'm sorry, Ruth, I hope you hear me now. My throat burned, but as the boat drifted out of sight, something in me eased, like unclenching a fist I hadn't realized I'd been holding all these years. When I stood, I saw Lena at the path behind me. She must have followed quietly. For a moment I braced myself for another lecture, but her face was soft, her eyes wet. She walked closer, stood beside me, and said simply, Truce. We stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the last ripples fade. After a long silence, she spoke again, her voice breaking. Mum, my fear isn't you, it's losing you. That's what I can't stop thinking about. I reached for her hand, squeezed it until she squeezed back. Then let's make a deal, I said gently. We'll set up a plan. You'll know when I host the suppers. I'll check in. Safety without shutting the door. She nodded, a small laugh slipping out, wet with tears. That's fair. We stood there together, dusk settling around us, our joined hands a fragile bridge over years of worry. And somewhere down the river my little boat sailed on, carrying my apology into the dark. It began with a scrap of paper Arthur pinned to the wish table. Fix it Saturday. Bring what's broken. At first, I thought no one would come. People throw things away now, don't they? But by mid-morning our yard was alive. Toasters with frayed cords, jeans with tired knees, a lamp that hadn't glowed in years. Arthur brought his toolbox and I laid out my sewing basket like a treasure chest. We set up under the oak tree, sunlight filtering through leaves, and neighbours came one by one. They didn't just drop things off, they stayed. Mrs. Patel laughed as we patched her apron, telling us about her first job in London. Jax and a friend fiddled with a bike chain until it spun smoothly again. Even Eleanor, exhausted nurse that she is, showed up with cookies, saying she'd forgotten what a Saturday could feel like when you weren't just recovering from the week. Then a man I didn't know approached, holding a dusty box with reverence. "It was my wife's," he whispered. Inside was a record player, silent for 15 years. He looked like he half hoped, half dreaded what we might find. Arthur adjusted wires, I polished the needle, and after a few tense minutes, a crackle filled the air. Then, music. Not perfect, but alive. The man's eyes filled. "She used to dance to this," he said softly. For a heartbeat, time folded and I saw what he saw. Her, alive in the sound. He left us with a thank you that carried more weight than words. As the day wound down, laughter drifted across the yard, mingling with the scent of lemonade and motor oil. People lingered, not just to fix things, but to be together. And as I tucked the tools away, I pulled out the recorder and spoke into it for Ben. "We're not saving the world, love. We're stitching its hem so it doesn't unravel." Later that evening, when the house had grown quiet again, I reached for the next folded slip in the jar. My hands knew before my eyes did. Wish number 9. Sing once in public. My throat tightened instantly. Singing was something I'd only ever done to myself. Washing dishes, rocking babies, humming into the wind. To sing where someone might hear me, it felt like peeling skin from bone, but there it was, written in Ben's old handwriting, daring me. I sat back, heart thudding like a drum, and whispered into the dark kitchen, "Oh, Ben, you really did know how to terrify me." It happened on a Thursday at supper night, when the stew was steaming and the corkboard was already crowded with folded notes. Eleanor came in cradling a guitar, casual as if it were just another casserole dish. She set it down beside the breadbasket and said, "I used to play a little." Jax grinned and pulled an upturned box close, drumming an easy rhythm with his palms. And before I could stop myself, before fear could slip its hand over my mouth, I said, "Maybe I'll sing." The words floated there, ridiculous and irreversible. I felt Lena's eyes snap toward me, questioning. Arthur gave the faintest nod, the kind you give when you want someone to dare. So Eleanor strummed the opening chords of a song so old it felt stitched into my bones. My voice came out shaky like a sparrow testing its wings. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." My throat wobbled, but the melody carried me. Jax's rhythm steadied my breath. Eleanor's guitar wrapped around me like a shawl. Halfway through, something cracked open inside. The tremble gave way to a tone that was mine, not perfect, but true. I saw Arthur's eyes crinkle. I saw Jax mouthing along, and then half the room joined. Voices rose in crooked harmony, soup spoons tapping time, laughter spilling between the lines. When the last word left me, it carried a laugh tangled with a sob. My hands were shaking, but I felt taller than I had in years. They clapped. Not polite, but like they were clapping for themselves too, for daring, for sharing. Later, when the bowls were empty and the last crumbs gone, I found Lena standing near the wish table, arms folded but her face softer than I'd seen in months. She reached into her purse, pulled out a scrap of paper and pinned it quietly among the others. I pretended not to watch, but when the room thinned out, I leaned close. In her careful handwriting, "I want to be less afraid." I touched the paper, then turned to her. "That's a good wish," I whispered. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled me into a hug, longer than worry usually allows, longer than a daughter usually dares. And for a moment we stood there, her heartbeat against mine, like two women holding the same note at last. The storm came without manners, no warning except a low rumble that rattled the glasses in my cupboard. By the time I made it to the porch, the sky had torn itself open. Rain fell sideways, hungry and relentless. The power blinked twice, then gave up. Silence except for the roar of water pressing against the house. I ran downstairs with a flashlight, heart hammering. The beam found the rising tide at my ankles, then my knees. The cardboard box was there, sagging in the corner, the box where I'd tucked Ben's jar slips for safekeeping. No, no, no. I splashed across, hauling it onto a chair, but it was too late. The bottom gave way, paper scattering like pale fish in the dirty water. I grabbed them by handfuls, pressing them against my chest. The ink smeared, letters dissolving in my hands, wishes vanishing before my eyes. It felt like losing him all over again. I knelt there, soaked and shaking, clutching wet scraps, as if I could wring the words back out. The flashlight trembled in my hand, casting frantic shadows. Upstairs, thunder cracked, the whole house groaning as if it remembered every storm we'd weathered before. Then, pounding on the front door. "Mae! Mae! It's Arthur!" Another voice, Jack's, calling through the rain. I stumbled up the stairs, tears mixing with storm water. They pushed inside with pumps and buckets, their clothes plastered to their skin. "We'll get it down," Arthur said firmly, already setting to work. Neighbours followed, Eleanor with towels, Mrs. Patel with a thermos of soup. They moved through the house like a tide in reverse, lifting, drying, steadying. My house was dark, but it pulsed with light all the same. When the water finally receded, I sat at the dining room table surrounded by damp paper. Some slips were ruined, blurred into grey mush. I laid them out gently, mourning each one. But then, one, still legible. The ink wavering but clear. Open a door with no sign on it yet. I held it like a lifeline. The words throbbed in the candlelight, a dare from the past. My gaze drifted to the dining room walls, the table surrounded by chairs, the corkboard leaning in the corner, the echoes of voices that had filled this space. For the first time, I didn't just see my home. I saw a room with no sign on it yet. A room waiting to be named. And I felt the storm leave something behind. Not just wreckage, but a beginning. It started with moving the furniture, one chair at a time, legs scraping across the wood floor, echoes bouncing in the quiet house. Evan arrived first, brush and paint tray in hand. "You always said these shelves needed life," he muttered, dipping into a bright, cheerful blue. Lena followed with clipboards and a stack of paper, her brow furrowed, but her voice steady. "If you're really doing this, Mom, it has to be safe. People need a ride list, an emergency contact chain, a way to keep it structured." I nodded, letting her take command of logistics while I brewed tea in the kitchen. When I returned, Mrs. Patel stood in the doorway, arms full of folded fabric. "From my husband's sari shop," she explained softly. "Too beautiful to sit in boxes. They deserve to hang where people laugh." She handed me long, shimmering strips of cloth, reds, golds, greens. Together we pinned them as bunting, colour unfurling across the room. Jax and Eleanor brought mismatched chairs from garages and thrift shops, no two alike. A spindleback painted green, a padded seat with a cigarette burn in the corner, a stool that wobbled until Arthur sanded the legs smooth. The table stretched longer than I remembered, as though it had grown to meet us. The corkboard leaned against the wall, taller than me. I pressed the first pin into it, a card reading, "The Wish Room. All hopes welcome. Leave one, take one, answer one." Then I stepped back. By the end of the week, the board was alive. A woman pinned a request for rides to her chemo appointments. 2 cards down, another pinned an offer. "I drive Tuesdays. Call me." A grandfather wanted someone to read aloud to his granddaughter. A teenager replied, "I love stories. I'll come." Arthur pinned, "Need a pie tutor." And under it someone scribbled, "Yes, please." The kettle hissed in the corner, steam curling toward the ceiling. Conversations overlapped, quiet, nervous at first, then warmer. My dining room, once a private space of grief, now hummed like a hive. I sat in the corner with my recorder, whispering to Ben. The jar wasn't just ours, was it? It was never only about what you and I dreamed up on that first anniversary. It was about what could happen when wishes are shared, when someone holds them up to the light and says, "Me too." The bunting swayed gently in the draught from the open door. People were still arriving, hanging up coats, pulling up chairs. The room no longer felt like mine alone. It was ours. And for the first time since the ground split and offered me that muddy jar, I felt the weight of possibility settle on my shoulders. And it wasn't heavy. It was exactly right. The phone rang just after breakfast, the kind of ring that startles the quiet. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me said, "Answer." The voice on the line was warm, a little shaky. "Is this Mae Whitaker? You don't know me, but my name is Claire. I'm Mara's niece. Mara, the baker from Riverton." My breath caught. Mara, the closed pie shop, the lace scrap in my pocket. Claire told me she'd seen the newspaper photo of our lantern walk, jars glowing along the river. "Someone mailed it to me," she said softly, "and I recognized your lace scrap in the picture. My aunt would have loved that night. She used to say wishes only matter when they're shared." I pressed the phone tighter. Claire explained how Mara's wish table in her bakery had carried her through hard seasons, notes from strangers pinned up like prayers. Then her voice cracked. "When the shop closed, I thought her table was gone forever. But then I saw your picture. You brought it back." A few days later, a padded envelope arrived. Inside was a card stained with butter and lemon zest marks like a map of use. On top, in looping handwriting, "Mara's lemon pie." I ran my finger over the grease-darkened corner, imagining her hands smoothing it flat, again and again. Arthur came that afternoon. He set his tool bag down, rolled up his sleeves. "All right, May," he said with a grin. "Today we bake for real." I measured carefully, whispered to the card as if Mara could hear me. Weezested lemons, the scent bright as sunlight. When the pie came out golden, not sunken, not soggy, I nearly cried. Arthur cut a neat slice, steam curling in the cool kitchen air. "That's it," he said. "That's the one." The next week I carried that pie, well, most of it, to the council meeting. Our Riverwalk relighting proposal was on the docket. The room smelled faintly of old books and dust until I lifted the lid from the pie tin. A ripple of murmurs moved through the chamber. We spoke, the four of us, Arthur, Eleanor, Jax, and me. Then hands rose one by one in favour. Approved. Afterward, I slipped a slice onto the clerk's desk and left another for the chairwoman. I walked out into the night grinning, pie tin under my arm, council stamp in my heart. Some victories taste like lemon and sugar. Some shine like light on water. And when both happen at once, you know you're exactly where you're meant to be. The flyer came slipped under my door, glossy paper catching the morning sun. A realtor's smile stretched across the top. No more headaches. Sell today, move tomorrow, condo by the lake. I almost laughed. Almost. Because some part of me, tired from floods, from paint cans, from too many late nights, did wonder what it would be like to cash out, to live where the grass was trimmed for you, where doors locked with a quiet click, where life was safe and contained. That afternoon, Lena stopped by with her careful voice. "Mom, this is practical. You'd have safety. You wouldn't be alone in storms. Think about it." Later, Evan called, his tone softer. "Space, Mom. You'd finally have space to rest without shouldering everything." And then Arthur, leaning on his cane by the fence, said simply, "May, choose the thing that lets you breathe, not what keeps you busy, not what pleases them, what lets you breathe." I walked the river at dusk with Ben in my head. Fireflies blinked like quiet signals. The water carried pieces of sky downstream. Out loud I asked, "Ben, what's home now? What's the right kind of roof when the heart's been cracked open?" The answer came not as thunder, but as a steadying in my chest. Home wasn't where the headaches disappeared. It was where wishes grew roots. This house, with its uneven floors and its wide table now crowded every Thursday night, was already more than wood and nails. It was becoming a harbour. So I made my choice. I crumpled the flyer, smoothed it once, then tore it in two. Not out of anger, out of clarity. I called Lena and Evan to the dining room. I said, "This house stays, and the wish room stays. But it can't stay fragile. It has to stand. We're going to make it official. A non-profit, guardrails, structure. And I need both of you." Lena folded her arms first, then softened. "Safety director?" she asked. I nodded. She exhaled like someone finally invited instead of managed. Evan grinned. "Operations, then. Paperwork's my middle name." We started a binder that night, plain and ordinary on the outside, but inside, a new kind of blueprint, pages of ideas, contacts, commitments. When I turned off the lights, I lingered in the doorway, watching the corkboard dotted with wishes that weren't mine alone anymore. I whispered into the dim, "I kept the house, love. Not because I couldn't leave, because this is where the breathing happens." The Riverwalk was dark when we arrived, the crowd holding its breath like a single body. Children fidgeted with mason jars glowing from inside, their candlelight making halos on eager faces. The mayor gave a nod, the switch was thrown, and for one aching second, nothing. Then a single bulb sputtered to life, another, and another, until the whole line of lamps flared into a ribbon of gold along the water's edge. People gasped, clapped, laughed with the relief of light returning. Someone near me whispered, "It looks like the river is wearing jewelry." I felt Ben in that moment, in the shimmer on the water, in the hands squeezing mine from either side, Evan on the left, Arthur on the right. The town that once felt sleepy and resigned was alive again, gathered under lamplight as though we'd all been waiting for this sign that darkness doesn't stay forever. Later, in the wish room, the kettle hissed, and the bunting trembled with every open door. We called it open door night, and the rule was simple. 3 minutes, one story, any truth you dared to share. A teenager told of her first job, fumbling scoops of ice cream into cones too small, and how the manager's patience taught her to slow down. An older man read the last letter his wife had written him, his voice breaking on every other word. Yet the room held him like a net. Eleanor shared the morning she had chosen to stay alive after a year of despair. Her hands shook, but her smile was wide at the end. Jax told a story about his grandmother teaching him to ride a bike, laughter in every pause. When it was my turn, I carried the blue jar to the center of the table. I let the silence stretch, let the crackle of the kettle fill the edges. "This jar was buried under my house," I said, fingers tracing the wax-stained rim. "Inside were wishes my Ben and I wrote when our marriage was brand new. I've read most of them aloud, lived many, but 2 slips blurred into ink and water. Gone." I lifted the fragile paper scraps. Maybe some wishes are meant to rinse back to sea. Maybe we're not supposed to know them. Maybe we're supposed to write new ones, together. The room was still, breathing as one. Then, one by one, people rose and pinned fresh cards to the board. New wishes, new roots. The kind that could light a town brighter than any string of lamps. Ben, love. If you can hear me, tonight the town looks like a necklace someone finally clasped around its own throat, but instead of choking it sings. The Riverwalk lamps glow steady, golden, reflected in the water like stars dropped just close enough to touch. Inside our house, the kettle hums like a small engine of comfort. Cups clink, and laughter rolls in waves against the walls. And the door, our door, is never locked anymore. People come and go as if it were theirs too, which I suppose it is. I want to thank them, the ones who showed up with hunger, not just in their bellies but in their hearts, and left carrying someone else's hope folded in their pocket. The boy who found work fixing bikes, the nurse who remembered how to sleep, the widower who learned to stitch a jacket, even my children who walked in first with doubt and now with casserole dishes, finally understanding that safety isn't the same as smallness. Tonight I opened the jar one last time. Only one slip was still legible, a bit of paper stubborn enough to resist ink and rain. I held it up to the light, my voice trembling as I read, teach someone what saved you. I looked around the room, the corkboard filled with wishes, the table crowded with mismatched chairs, the steam curling above the cups, and I realized I already had. I placed that slip back in the jar, not to bury it, but to keep it alive. This jar isn't a relic anymore, it's a rhythm. A reminder that we don't run out of chances unless we stop offering them. So Ben, friend who listens to my voice, I'll leave you with this. A life isn't a ledger to balance. It's not debts and credits, mistakes and perfect days weighed like coins. No. A life is a jar you keep opening, again and again. You add, you take, you share, you risk, you lose some slips to water, you find others glowing in hands you didn't know you could trust. And maybe someday, when someone else digs into the earth beneath their own tired house, they'll find what we left here. A story, a table, a room where wishes kept the lights burning. And they'll know our names, not because they're carved in stone, but because they're written in laughter, in footsteps on the river walk, in cups raised to lips. The kettle whistles, someone laughs across the table. I'll leave it here, our door still open, our river still remembering. What part of this story touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read them. If this story felt close to your heart, give it a like, subscribe if you want to be part of a space where real stories matter. Got a couple more minutes? Check out the next story. It's also about the things we rarely say out loud.